Finally, let's close this first Ajax section by looking at the very simple and useful load function. So the big idea here is that what we just did in the previous example is common. It's very common to go to the server, invoke some URL, grab the content that comes back from that URL, and just shove it into the page, insert it into the page without making any changes to it and without really looking at the text that comes back. Just insert it in verbatim. And this process is sometimes called content-centric Ajax. In other words, the server supplies the content, the browser receives the content, just believes the server and inserts it in directly. Later on, we'll see another form of Ajax, which is sometimes called data-centric Ajax, where the server doesn't send the string or the HTML that will be inserted into the page. Instead, the server sends a piece of data, often in JSON format. And then the JavaScript response handler has to read that data, extract information out of it, build a string, and then insert that into the page. That data-centric approach, which we'll look at later, is more complicated, but it also makes the server-side code more reusable. The server-side code doesn't need to supply the string that the browser needs, just the raw data that the string is based on. But anyway, content-centric Ajax is very common. It's certainly not the only approach, but it's common. So jQuery builds in something that makes it even simpler than using $.Ajax. It's the load function. And the simplest version is almost magically easy. And you kind of read it backwards. Go to this address, retrieve the content, and insert the result here. Or let me say it forwards. Find all HTML elements that match this CSS pattern and insert into them the contents of this address. All right, before we go any farther, let's just try that piece, that form of the load function. Here's the jQuery test page that we've used several times before. It just defines some HTML elements and loads the basic jQuery file. We bring up Firebug. And now let's try load. So we match some elements. Let's find all the H1 elements and load into them the content of server results.txt. And that's really all there is to it. Another way to read it is to read it backwards. Go and retrieve server result.txt and insert it into everything that matches that pattern. All right, we did this before, but it took us 3 or 4 lines of code. Now we can do it in 1 line of code. And instead of getting the plain text file, we can do the JSP page, server time.jsp, insert it in, and we see the results. Now, of course, it's much more common to insert the results into one specified location that's initially empty, but this illustrates how easy it is to use the load function. So don't be intimidated when I show a few options to the load function. It's very easy. So we interactively demonstrated the use of the simplest form of the load function. Find all HTML elements that match that CSS pattern and load the contents of that URL inside of them. Now, slightly more common in real life is to pass some data to the server, and that URL will receive the data and build some content based on what you pass it. We'll cover that in the next section. So load is still very simple, but it's quite common to pass some information to the server to kind of customize how the server-side program runs. And then there's a third option where you get a handler function. And let me explain a little bit about why you might want that handler function in real life, but it's not used that commonly. So we'll just briefly summarize it and then use the simpler forms for the rest of the lectures. Why would you want a handler function for load? After all, the main functionality is already built in. The main functionality is take the result that comes back from the server and insert it into the page. So why do you want something extra? And the answer is, well, you might want to do some additional side effects. In other words, after the results have been loaded into the page, you might want to pop up a message alerting the user to the fact that the results have been loaded into the page. However, you're kind of making load complicated. Load is supposed to be simple. Insert the results into the page, verbatim, unchanged, and you're finished. And so often it's better to just give up and say, we've already got $.Ajax. We already know how to use it. Why try to force load into something that it's not really intended for? And we'll just use $.Ajax if we're going to do something other than just inserting some content into the page unchanged. I also want to point out that if you use that extra handler function, again, it's pretty rare, it's a little bit tricky because the Ajax request is asynchronous. Originally, Ajax stood for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It's not usually XML anymore, but it still is usually asynchronous. In other words, the order that you call the functions is not the order that the functions finish. So suppose you had some sort of message that says, I am getting data from the server, please wait. And use jQuery to turn that message on. You made it visible. I am waiting for data from the server, please wait. And then you said, go get some data from the server and insert it into the page. And then you turn off the message that says, I'm waiting for data from the server. That seems natural, but it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is the middle line doesn't finish right away. It finishes sometime later when the result comes back from the server, and making a network connection is relatively slow compared to anything that you would do locally. So what would actually happen is the message, I'm waiting for data from the server, would pop up, and then it would immediately disappear. And then later in time, the result from the server would appear, and the final functionality of load would be invoked. So what I'm really trying to get at here is making a separate handler function for load, even though the API jQuery says you can do it, is probably not what you want. It clutters up load, use $.Ajax, and the kind of obvious tasks you would use it for don't work because of the asynchronous nature of the Ajax calls. So stick with the basic version of .load, where you either invoke a URL and insert the content unchanged, or you pass data to a URL, take the result back, and insert it unchanged. All right, so let's try that basic version. So I make a function that simply says, go to the server, grab that result, and insert it here. And again, you can read it backwards. You can read it, go to the server and grab that result, and then insert it here. Or you can read it forwards. Find all HTML elements in the page that match this, since it's an ID, there's only one, and insert into them, load into them, the contents of this address. We did that interactively, but now we are going to connect it to a button, just like we did before, and the button will have an ID. So when we run this example, it has exactly the same behavior as the third button did. It works the same way. It's just shorter and simpler. So we introduced $.Ajax first because it's much more flexible and general purpose. But if all you're going to do with $Ajax is call a response handler that inserts the text into the page unchanged, never looks at the text, never modifies the text, and never generates any new text, then use load instead. It's simpler.